Good morning. It's an honor and a privilege to be here and get the opportunity to present a paper on South Asian security stuff. The title of my paper is Combating Terrorism and Insurgency in South Asia, Militarized, Policing and Beyond. Just a quick overview of what I'm going to present in the next few minutes. I will begin with an empirical puzzle which will drive my research question, and I will try to define my the rationale for studying this issue of combating terrorism and insurgency, and why and how the militarization trend is emerging as a new phenomena for South Asia. I'll discuss the literature review, identify the gaps, and discuss the contributions of the study. And finally, I'll present my research findings and draw a conclusion. The puzzle is quite interesting. What we see is that there is a variation in the way South Asian 8 countries, starting from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, they experience varying level of threats coming from terrorists and insurgent groups. For example, the threats from Al-Qaeda, the ISIS, and the local Taliban are quite different in these countries. These tend to be very high in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and their influence among the local groups in other countries are also moderate. Kashmir-focused militancy in India, for example, has recently expanded to the interior of India. Left-wing insurgency has a varying level of presence, high or very active in India and Nepal, but relatively moderate or low in Bangladesh. Ethnic and separatist movements are also quite different in these countries. For example, in Bangladesh, the CHT insurgency has been relatively suppressed, and also it ended with the conclusion of a peace accord in 1996 or 1997. And also in Sri Lanka, a heavy-handed militarized counterinsurgency has ended the Tamil insurgency. But ethnic and separatist insurgencies are relatively more visible and more active in India and Pakistan. What I argue is that despite this varying level of threats coming from terrorists and insurgent groups, there appears to be similar responses. We see that increasingly militarized responses in the domain of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. This leads to my research question: how has militarization shaped the counterterrorism and counterinsurgency domains in South Asia, and what implications does it have for the operational space for the civilian law enforcement agencies? This question of operational space comes because traditionally it is thought that containing terrorism or insurgency can be a law enforcement problem, and it is the civilian police who are better able to deal with this. So the question is, if a military is increasingly participating in CT and COIN domains, whether it shrinks the operational space for the civilian police. There are obvious reasons for studying these questions. I mean, there are plenty of works on similar topics in the European and North American context, but relatively, it is a relatively underexplored and under-theorized area of studies. And I would like to fill that gap in the existing literature by studying the cross-country comparison of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency practices and the role of military and civilian police in these domains. When I do the literature survey, I find that relatively there are 3 distinct disciplines which or sub-disciplines which tackle this issue. One, criminology and police science, where scholars have increasingly looked into the phenomenon of militarization of police. But when I look into the security studies sub-discipline of IR, I find that they talk about the war model of counterterrorism, which means that there are at least 3 different approaches to fighting terrorism: a war model, a criminal justice model, and a public health model. The war model argues that terrorism is essentially a form of irregular war, and it is the military which is best suited to fight it. By contrast, the criminal justice model argues that terrorism should be better conceived as a law enforcement problem. It's a crime, so it is the civilian police which is better able to deal with that. By contrast, the public health model argues that terrorism is neither a war nor a crime. It is like a disease, and it is that there is a need for diagnosing the problem and the integration of the whole society. The civilian police, the civil society, the academics, and the whole gamut of the society need to be engaged. So looking at the war model, we find that there are, it provides a better explanation for understanding how the the domains of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency are increasingly filled in by the deployment of military forces. And there is a third discourse which tackles the humanitarian, the human rights implications of, excessive use of force in the name of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. Okay, what I find is that the issue of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, is discussed quite widely in the criminal justice and police science literature, where Peter Kraska has offered a compelling argument that, in fact, drawing evidence from the American context that the American government is fighting a war on drugs, and it has increased the number of SWAT forces, the special weapons and tactics, and they are, unlike the civilian defensive policing model where police would go into the neighborhood, patrol the areas, and be more restrained in the use of force. The SWATs are more militarized, heavily equipped with arms, heavily, uniformed, and they tend to, spread fear rather than inject, peace among the communities. So basically, what Kraska argues is that militarization is becoming a normal phenomena, a normalized phenomena, and he defines it as a process of arming, organizing, planning, training for threatening, and sometimes implementing violent conflicts. There are plenty of drawing. There are scholars who have accepted Kraska's theory and looked into the French cases of how the gendarmerie has increasing role in France, the armed response unit in the United Kingdom. Another school of thought, which also belongs to this militarization of police thesis, argues that there's an interesting trend of politicization of the military, which means that when the military forces or the armed forces are deployed for doing police tasks, and this theory is getting more attention in the post-9/11 context, where the military forces are increasingly participating in law enforcement operations. U.S. military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq is a glaring example of this. Interestingly, this politicization of military and the militarization of the police has also brought into the question of the command and control issue, like who is controlling them? Is it the Minister of Defense or the Minister of Interior or the Home Affairs? And there are split evidence. In some cases, it is the Minister of Defense. In other cases, it is the Ministry of Home Affairs or the civilian law enforcement agencies. The question is what I'm going to argue here. My argument is that, well, militarization of police and politicization of military is interesting, and it provides a necessary explanation for understanding the South Asian CT and COIN responses. But I think that a better and fuller account of the South Asian counterterrorism and counterinsurgency responses will require us to understand how there is also a phenomenon called militarization of the intelligence community. What I mean here is that and this can happen in three ways: dual mandates, leadership role, and representation. Dual mandates is simple. It means that when we discuss traditional and non-traditional security, the idea is that traditional security is about the protection of the territorial integrity of the state. And it is the military or the armed forces which is better able to do that. By contrast, the non-traditional security is more about the protection of individuals from violent and non-violent threats, and which requires adding more non-military dimensions into providing security. So what is interesting is that there is a distinction between internal security and external security. And the idea, the traditional concept is that the military is better able to promote, defend external security, and civilian law enforcement is better able to do with the, internal security. Dual mandates is a concept that refers to the fact that military is ideally, theoretically responsible for, defending external security, but there are growing evidence that they may also have dual mandates, an extended mandate in internal security as well. Leadership role, what it means is that, in the post-9/11 context, civilian and military forces will compete for leadership role. The leadership role in the context of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, which means that at the end of the day, for practitioners, the question will be which is the lead force in a country or in a city or in a district or in a province. and militarization of intelligence will, it can also be observed by looking at whether military forces or military controlled intelligence agencies are assuming lead CT role in some cases. Representation, what I mean here is that the issue is militarization can also happen in the highest level decision making process, and by looking at the composition of the National Security Council, the composition of the national intelligence coordination structures, we can see to what extent our civilian, law enforcement, and military forces are having representation in the highest level security coordination committees responsible for these three domains: counterterrorism, national security, and intel coordination. So in the literature, there are also a little bit of discussions on drivers of militarization, like which factors are driving it. Is it external or is it domestic? Globalization argues that in the age of transnationalization, what we are seeing is the blurring the lines of internal and external security. And as it is blurred, we can't just expect a demarcated jurisdiction for civilian law enforcement and military forces. And the other argument is that it is not only the external aspect of globalization, but also internal preferences of the agencies which also want to militarize. So civilian law enforcement agencies want to have more weapons, more mandates for the use of force, more military posters. So that can explain that they consciously want it. Similarly, military forces also want to have an increasing mandates in the domain of internal security. So then the question is, what kind of data do I have? This is the boring research methods for academics. Findings. If you just quickly look at the figure here, this is the number of militarized police units. It is also called PPUs, paramilitary police units in South Asia. The number is much higher in India because in almost all of the states in India have got their own paramilitary police units. Just a few names to give you an idea of who am I referring to actually by the concept of militarized policing: the ANCOP, Afghan National Civil Order Police in Afghanistan, the Rapid Action Battalion in Bangladesh, the anti-terrorism squads in many states of India, in Pakistan, the CTF, in Sri Lanka, the Special Task Force. This is fascinating. It shows that the number has significantly increased in the post-9/11 era. And actually, this slide can mislead you because we can instantly draw a conclusion that it is the American war on terrorism, the global war on terrorism, that has presented an external compulsion for the South Asian countries to increase their number of militarized police units. Absolutely not. Because a closer look and in-depth case studies in each of these country cases will provide us unique ideas that there are more national imperatives for the creation of these militarized police units. So, after the Mumbai attacks, after the attacks on the Indian National Parliament, there was a growing, the states have long had this agenda of creating their special police units, but those are put on hold. But as high-profile terror incidents happened, it was much more easier for the government to create the forces. Politicization of the military also it's well evident in all of the South Asian countries. I have just listed a number of special operations forces and their significant role in the domains of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency. Also, now this is the data to support the alternative argument that militarization also happens in the domains of security and intelligence agencies. Dual mandates, do we see it? Yes, almost in all of the countries except for India. That also indicates the type of civil-military relations we have in South Asia, and the variations in civil-military relations can explain why in some countries military-controlled intelligence agencies have dual mandates and why such dual mandates are absent in other countries. Search for leadership role. Yes, there are more than a dozen military-controlled intelligence agencies which have asserted lead CT role in countries. In operational context, this is a serious problem in some cases. I'll finish in 1 or 2 minutes. This is the highest level coordination structures on the second column. First column refers to countries. Second column refers to the abbreviation of the coordination structures. And the last two columns show whether the military or the civilian police have got representation. Interestingly, military is well represented in all of these countries. And so basically, by looking at the composition of the coordination structures, we can see that militarization is not only about military forces participating in law and order problems or special forces participating in some operations. They also have quite good representation in the senior level structure. So the conclusion: what do these findings actually contribute to the literature and the theory? And I argue that cross-cut theory is validated by the South Asian countries and their practices, but I refine and fine-tune and I contribute to the literature by extending cross-cut theory into the domains of intelligence community. And as I argued that the post-9/11 shows an increasing tendency of militarization of the police, but it can partially explain by the external imperatives, but more by the domestic compulsions. The sub-theme of this conference is about the context of cooperation, and I find that there are two different models of cooperation: bilateral and regional. Interestingly, India has shown quite a robust, it's a fairly strong ability to promote bilateral cooperation, but not with all the countries, with selective countries. Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka, I think, have got more bilateral cooperation with India in the domains of intelligence sharing, capacity building of the military and civilian law enforcement, confidence building among the border forces, and selective cases of joint cross-border cooperation. SAARC has failed to meet the aspirations of the South Asian countries in terms of delivering regional cooperation on these areas. Two examples would be that there are SAARC regional desks on monitoring terrorism and drug offenses. They have not been fully functional yet. And the idea of SAARC-POL, South Asian Regional Police Cooperation Unit, has not got traction among the leaders, and there is an institutional moratorium on that. So countries have preferred to adopt a bilateral channels for cooperation rather than a regional channel. I must conclude here, and I thank the audience to listen to me. Thank you so much.